Well, let's begin by telling you what's happening at the moment. Well, the U.S. President Joe Biden is likely to arrive in Delhi in just a few minutes from now. He'll be touching down at about 6:10 and will be having that bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Modi at about 7:35 p.m. We'll be waiting to watch for what comes out from that bilateral, an important meeting between the two leaders. We know that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has already arrived in New Delhi, as has the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. And UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has landed in Delhi this afternoon. Before that, there was a press statement by his side, which has already set the tone of what the conversation will be as far as UK is concerned. It's going to be a focus on the Russia-Ukraine war. Some strong words there from the Prime Minister. Sunak arrived with his wife, Akshata Murthy. Sunak is expected to urge support for the Russian cause. And of course, apart from that, will hold bilateral discussions on the FTA movement. Both sides have not been able to reach a consensus on that. On the free trade agreement, there are differences on what should be included. The Indian side wants visa and immigration laws to be eased up. And the UK, of course, wants, trade barriers to be removed as well. We also know that the leaders from Japan, Africa Union, Bangladesh have also arrived for the G20 Summit. Earlier today, the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and the Argentine President Alberto Fernandez also arrived in New Delhi. Meanwhile, the United States Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has said she will be focusing on building support to increase lending resources for the IMF. Did you run the bike?
This week also provides an opportunity to discuss debt relief. We continue to support efforts to provide predictable, orderly, and timely debt relief to countries, including under the Common Framework for Debt Treatment, where progress has been too slow.
Good morning, everyone.
Up to the expectations of the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Earlier, Prime Minister Modi said India's presidency should be inclusive, decisive, ambitious and action-oriented. Let's listen in.
I'm just observing that last time when we had the last meeting of the G20, we succeeded and we had a common statement, we had a declaration, and I'm observing that for some countries it seems to be more difficult today to agree on a clear position, condemning and also sanctioning Russia for this decision to launch this war against Ukraine.
And as we said, the Prime Minister Modi is scheduled to hold a string of bilaterals, 15 bilateral meetings through the weekend, out of which at least 3 of them are expected to take place today itself. As per the tentative schedule of bilaterals being held, Prime Minister Modi will be meeting, as we said, the US President Joe Biden, the Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, and also the Mauritius Prime Minister.
New Delhi leaders' declaration is almost ready. I would not like to dwell on it because this declaration will be recommended to the leaders and the leaders will then accept it. And only after it has been accepted by the leaders, we'll be able to talk about the actual achievements of this declaration.
All right, so a lot slated there today for the bilaterals, and also, of course, the important focus will be on the multilateral cooperation between all these sides. India's focus, of course, on food and energy security, on multilateral banks, on the global south, and we'll be talking about all of this in the course of this show. Right, we're now being joined by Dr. Shrikant Kondapalli, Dean of School of International Studies and Professor of China Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Dr. Shrikant Kondapalli, thanks very much indeed for joining us on the show today. Let me begin by just asking you, what are your expectations from the G20 given the tone from several of the Western countries already?
Well, as you just played, the announcement that the declaration draft is already ready. And in the last 220 meetings so far in different cities in India, there has been a number of discussions, finance, foreign policy, central banks, environment ministries, NGOs, health ministries, cyber-related matters, agriculture ministries, and of course the commerce and macroeconomic situation, infrastructure, that is roads, railways, transportation. They have all met, and it appears that there is a lot of consensus on these issues. It is well known that there are differences between G20 countries, as is reflected in the Bali summit meeting last year on the Ukrainian conflict. However, on a number of other issues, there has been a lot of consensus. And these include, number one, I think, economic recovery. After the pandemic, we have seen economic, decline in many countries, negative growth rates in Europe, and for the much of the world because of the kind of distress that has originated with the COVID pandemic spread across the globe, and contraction in demand for the goods and services. There is also the technological disruption in a more positive manner, but also there is a negative effect of cyber attacks. Positive ones in terms of AI, Internet of Things, 3D printing, and a host of other technological issues. So there is also the supply chain disruption, which has caused a lot of hardships for people because of the transportation sector being shut down. And that resulted in Japan, Australia, India putting across the supply chain resilience initiative 2 years ago. And so these are some of the things that the G20 is likely to declare on the 9th.
Right. Dr. Kondapalli, thanks very much. Stay with us. Now, we do want to talk about the focus, of course, being the U.S. India bilateral meeting that is likely to happen, this evening. And the president is likely to touch down very soon. The statements coming off, of course, from America are two-faceted. One, of course, on the issues that they will raise on the multilateral forum that is about, raising debt funding for the developing world, restructuring the multilateral banks, having enough funds to sort of wean away the developing world from the coercive policies of China, as America has said. On the bilateral front, of course, there's a lot to talk about between Prime Minister Modi and the U.S. President as well, whether it is the nuclear reactors, the jet engine deal, the drones, the Reaper drones, the issues of visa. All of this is likely to, of course, come up in that bilateral. I believe my colleague Jessica Stone from Voice of America is with us at the moment. And Jessica, much expectation as far as the bilateral is concerned. What are you picking up?
Well, I'm coming to you from the Baha'i House of Worship, which is also better known as the Lotus Monument. And of course, there are still people coming to pray here, even though there's an utter lockdown throughout the city to really clear the way for all of those dignitaries to come in and create those meetings. As you rightly point out, President Biden due to touch down within the hour here at Indira Gandhi Airport and pretty much straight away go into a bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Modi. They are expected to move the ball forward, so to speak, on that GE engine deal. Just about a week ago, the U.S. Congress passed the hurdle of having to approve that engine deal. Of course, there's a lot of export controls around sharing that type of technology. GE will work with Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, of course, to produce those engines for the Indian Air Force in India. That's a first of its kind deal. It was in the MOU status during the June state visit. It's now moved forward to having the U.S. Congress approval, and it still has a few more steps to go, but they will be sure to discuss that and move that ball forward. You mentioned the drone deal. That's also under discussion. And we've really, up until this visit, seen a steady drumbeat of movement on trade. For example, in June, 5 out of 6 of the World Trade Organization complaints between these two countries were resolved. They're expected to resolve the final one here in India during the talks and make some announcements in that regard. And that's really key because, of course, the U.S. is looking not only for a defense partnership with India, which India may be reticent to have, but a business an economic relationship and deepening that, particularly around critical minerals and U.S. companies having the ability now to invest in semiconductor manufacturing and other quantum computing type of work. That's a key way that these two countries are countering China in the economic space because, of course, the semiconductor manufacturing space is highly regulated now by the U.S. government in terms of access to the production machines. And so this is a piece of the conversation where these two countries are drawing closer together as well. Berbi?
Very important points, Jessica, you're making there about the bilateral discussion between these two countries, but also on the multilateral level. The focus has always been for the U.S. at the G20 of how to corner, in a sense, Russia and China. There'll be talks about supply chain resilience. There'll be talk about debt restructuring, and of course, the elephant in the room, the joint communique to add Russia's invasion, as it were, of UK and the repercussions of that as well.
Yeah, of course, this is a giant sticking point, right? It was a giant sticking point in Bali, where in the 11th hour they came up with language that most of the countries of the G20 strongly condemn the invasion of Ukraine and acknowledge the economic impacts of that invasion on the rest of the world. Well, look, the Russians have signaled very clearly that they're not going to agree to that type of language again. And they've signaled very clearly further than that, that if in fact they are to sign on to an ultimate communique, it needs to acknowledge their position on Kyiv. And so that really leaves Prime Minister Modi and the G20 Sherpa in India in a very challenging position to come up with language that can be agreed upon by these world powers. It obviously represents a huge division in the G20, and coming up with that communique in some ways is not only a reflection on India, who of course does not want to be the first host country not to be able to provide a joint communique at the end of these meetings, but also India has been seeing itself as a bridge builder between and a solution finder with respect to the U.S.-China relationship and the divisions within the G20 bloc. The G20, in some ways, is on trial here, right? As a group of countries and economic framework as to whether it can be effective. And the Americans are coming into India knowing that full well, that in order to make sure that that they communicate that the G20 still has relevance to the global economy, that they do need to come up with a joint communique that acknowledges the economic advancements that happen during these meetings, but also the security advancements. And so they're going to be working on that very closely over the next hours, if you will. One other thing I want to point out is Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, did a press conference with reporters during the flight over here, in which he said it's not just Ukraine that's a divisive issue. It's also climate change. You, of course, have a divide in G20 economies between the more developed economies, the more industrialized economies, countries that have polluted for far longer, those that are heavily energy, that are big energy explorers like Saudi Arabia, that are holding back on reducing their emissions, whereas the developing world, and particularly India and China, want to see historic emissions come into play and don't want to have to reduce their emissions as much as the historic polluters, particularly those in Europe and the United States. So that'll be a key division to watch to see what kind of language the Sherpas can come up with on that score as well.
Yes, climate support remains a very divisive issue as well.